My favorite thing was when you came out on Saturday night and you said you felt like a 2-liter of soda that's been shaken up.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
And I did this whole weekend. There was maybe a little extra emotion, just so much effort, but not effort.
Yeah, it's been a long road to get to this point.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of times people don't realize that we didn't just think of Revelation, oh, let's do a series on that last week or last month. But it's been much longer than that.
It has.
And so does that have anything to do with your personal relationship with the book of Revelation, or?
So obviously I was been pursuing a master's degree at Wheaton for the last 4 years and finished this year, or graduated this year, right? I think so.
I think so.
Yeah, it was this year. And so last year my final class was in Chicago at Wheaton. A hermeneutics class. It was really actually initially felt like it was going to be a very difficult class. A lot of homework or pre-work that I had to do, and I was honestly a bit resentful that I had to do it. And I was in the middle of a big motorcycle trip over the summer at the time, and it was hard. I tried to ask my professor for a bit of a break, and he did not give it to me. And so I was having to ride, after riding a motorcycle all day, I was having to get into a hotel and actually, answer all these pretty deep questions. And so I had not met this professor. We go in and ended up being one of my favorite weeks of classes that I had in the entire 4 years. His name is Dr. Chris Vlachos, was just amazing and had the best time just learning from him that week, and all of us brothers in the class, everyone kind of just loved it. I could tell it was a really great week. And the final day, we knew he had mentioned that he had taught Revelation at Wheaton for 16 years, I want to say, and so the final day, he was like, "I'm gonna do a little exegesis of Revelation 1," and so cool. So he starts rolling through Revelation 1, and much of what I did this weekend was at least the genesis of it, and many of the thoughts, the obedience point in particular, came from Dr. Chris Vlachos. So I knew at the moment that he did that, I walked out, I was so encouraged and had seen the book in such a different way, just in the brief moments, the hour or so that he taught us. I just remember thinking, this has to be shared. This has to, I realized there's so much more in this book. And I was so curious about what was in this book. I had read Revelation before, but to be honest with you, it didn't make much sense. I've heard all the end times teaching. I've been around that whole thing for a long time. And I mean, I can understand it, but also it was just, I didn't feel that was not my gifting or qualification. I'm not much into geopolitical conversations, even awareness. I don't follow the news too much. I don't know, who's got troops where, what world leaders likely to do what. I'm just not into any of that's just never been my makeup. I don't think about that stuff. I couldn't make myself think about it if you asked me to. And so the kind of place that I had come from, what I knew of Revelation felt like mostly that kind of conversation. What's this nation going to do here? What's this one going to do here? And so I'm just kind of like, well, that's not for me. I don't know what to do with this book. But when I heard what he was saying, I just remember thinking, this is different. I want to know more about. I really do. And not just want to know, but I felt like the church needs this. And at the same time, I guess Matt Chandler, who is in my cohort as well, and a friend, had just finished, I think the year before, or just maybe the fall before, teaching through Revelation. And I was aware of that as well, and how encouraging it had been. And so I just kind of felt like we should do something with this. I feel like this needs to be done. And so I think I came back and we talked about it, and I don't know, it just didn't feel like it wasn't quite the right time. I knew that when we were going to do it, we were going to need to really put the effort into it and really, because Revelation is not a book you approach lightly. And so, earlier this year, just kind of felt like, you know what, this fall seems like the right time. It just seems like God's leading us in that direction. And so reached out to Dr. Vlachos and said, would you come and teach us for 3 days if you can? And so he came in, what was it, July, I think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It was my favorite 3 days of July. I loved it.
So good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we took 3 days and he just taught all day, every day, each of those days, working through the book of Revelation, and it was stunning. It was amazing. And so I think, first of all, I didn't get to do it this weekend. I need to try to find a weekend where I can do it. But just he gets a lot of credit for this. I mean, there's so much so much of the kind of impetus and the things that we shared were things that were his that were prompted by his. As he said, I feel like I rubbed a couple of sticks together and got a fire going, and you guys took it to the next place.
You could feel the excitement, like just in the classroom setting of all of the pastors as we were walking through these texts. Just, this is going to be incredible to talk about. And I remember him making a joke that if you see like a hooded figure in the back of the auditorium, it's probably him because he snuck into here.
That's right. Yeah. And he sent me the most wonderful text this weekend. Probably the best text I got was from Dr. Vlachos. And man, it was just, he was listening live to the 10:30 service, and oh man, his words meant so much. I shared them with you guys, but it was really cool. And I'm so just credit where credit's due. I'm deeply, deeply indebted to Dr. Vlachos for this series, and the Lord certainly used him to kind of stir in us this season and what's happening. And it's been pretty. It was really cool.
Why do you think that the book of Revelation is so divisive, or in some contexts it's divisive or confusing? Yeah, what do you think that is about for people?
Well, I do think there's a mix of feelings around this book. There's no doubt about it. People come from different ways. I've been describing people that this is like their favorite book of the Bible. And I do think there's a certain, the mystery and the riddle of it all is really fun for people to try to unravel and solve, and, more power to them. That's fine. I'm not here to make a stand against that kind of effort, but it does to the, average person. I think folks like that sometimes don't realize how off-putting that can be to someone who just doesn't feel like either they don't feel like that's their area of expertise, or two, they still have a lot of questions about your very certain concrete predictions or let's say I don't know if I call it labels or attachments. This is this. This is this. This is what this means. And I think a lot of people have just been burned by all sorts of dogmatic, the mark of the beast is this, or the Antichrist will be this. And if you've been around the church world for long enough, you've heard those predictions change. And I think that there's some, if I can take a risk here and be a little bit, say something that might be, I don't know, mess with some folks a little, but it's interesting to me that the Antichrist is always, he's never American. And he's always an enemy, whoever the current enemy is of the United States, the biggest threat. Generally, we think that's where that's where the Antichrist is coming from. And that seems dubious to me. Seems a little self-serving or a little short-sighted maybe.
Yeah.
But we just tend to attach, like after 9/11, it was easy to say that the Antichrist was going to be a Muslim somehow, and then, some Muslim leader, and then, when the church is in the middle of, I don't know, is it, if it's communism then he's going to be Russian, or he's, it's just like, I've watched all of that, and I've seen so many predictions of this is, there's these blood moons, and then this is going to happen, and it's just like, well, no, it's not. It didn't. Mm-hmm. So we just keep kind of kicking the can down the field. I mean, I remember a book when I was a kid. I don't know if you ever heard of this book, 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1988.
Oh yeah, but didn't. He didn't.
And
then
and then there was another book about 89.
Yes.
I looked it up this week. Yeah. I looked it up this week, and I'm just like, okay. And so, and what's interesting is that, as far as I know, no one ever comes out and says, I got to rethink some things. I've been way off, or at least clearly like my predictions are wrong. They just move on and make another prediction. Mm-hmm. And somehow but I think, there's the reason that people like, why does that stuff work is because it sells. I think it's clickbait. People are curious, and I'm curious. And so it's interesting. I think there's that, and then I think there's other aspects of Revelation that just feel really scary to people, and because it is a book about suffering and persecution, and it's not a pleasant picture always, and so that's scary and uncertain, and I don't know what to do with that. So I think there's a lot of reasons why. I remember hearing a sermon of a guy talking about like a prediction of the future that like maybe this, and I don't even remember what he was describing from scripture, but he talked about it being potentially an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, detonated, which would basically shut down all electricity, anything that had an electronic whatever in it, it would just kill it immediately. Any device, a car, a phone, a computer, anything. And he was talking about, this sounds like it could be describing that being detonated over the middle of the, over the United States or something like this. And I remember being like, what? Whoa. And so like Heather and I are, having a conversation like, all right, if an EMP goes off and we, where are we going to meet? Because we won't be able to contact each other. If we happen to be separated, what will we do? Let's go get the kids, here's how, but you won't be able to drive, and we'll be walking. Those things are paralyzing. They're kind of mentally crippling to live with, that kind of.
Yeah, I think that's why, like Revelation, you said it's kind of a scary book. And so if somebody comes with certainty, then at a certain level, you don't have to deal with the fear. You can explain that away. Yeah. So I think that's why some of those things are so attractive to us. And depending on your discipleship to Jesus, your familiarity with studying Scripture in the first place, apocalyptic literature isn't going to be the first place you go. Like you're not like Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelation. Those are where I need to start in my Bible study journey.
Well, they feel really unfamiliar to us too. I mean, they're written in a style that we don't quite know how to interpret or understand. But I think when you start to see when you kind of strip away, and again, I'm not saying that no one ever should try to understand who is this player and whatever, and is this representative of the Roman Empire? Is it a more modern geopolitical reality or whatever? So not saying that we should never do that, but when you start to strip that back and just go, let's not. So I'll tell you where I first encountered this was we were studying prophecy. I was part of a Wheaton class, and we were interpreting Daniel 7. And if you don't know Daniel 7, it's this crazy vision that Daniel has of all these beasts and crazy beasts. You get a leopard with wings and a bear with some all hunched over and all these interesting descriptions of beasts. I can't recall exactly each one of them. And I had heard, Daniel 7, I'd heard before. I heard about, but the way that I always understood Daniel 7 or any prophetic teaching like this is that you're to look at these beasts through a historical lens. So you would say, oh, okay, a leopard with wings, that's the Roman Empire, whom I don't know who gets attached to who. That's Persia. And okay, like, what do I know about ancient Persia? I don't. And how to relate the vision that Daniel has to which empire is beyond the scope of what I can do. And so most of what I would catch from any teaching like that is more historical empire, and how any of that might predict, is this a future empire? Are we talking about current geopolitical realities? And is this Russia? Is this this one is an emerging empire that we don't know of yet, but it'll be a conglomeration of this nation and this nation, and then you're just like okay, When I read it, stripping all that away and not thinking about who was who, and just thinking about what's actually happening here, take it at face value. There are these different beasts, these different empires. No doubt they represent kings, and that they're brought onto the world stage. And when you read it, it's interesting. You read Daniel 7, you get this, and they were given, like this beast was given. Well, given? It was made to this. You start to go, wait a minute, there's another player here. Someone, and of course you've read about, like in Daniel 7, it references the Ancient of Days, and this is talking about the Lord God Almighty, like God the Father. And so you're like, oh wow, he's bringing these empires on and off the stage. And so immediately you start to see something in the nature of how God works and what he's doing. Regardless of who this is or which time this is, I'm seeing God in a whole different way, rather than focusing on the exact nature of these beasts. I'm seeing God work in a different way. And then, so you get all these beasts, and man, to read this, it was just amazing. It talks about then one like a son of man steps up, and you're just like, yeah, and it's just like, it's Jesus. And I still remember being in my house and being so moved and excited at what I was reading and feeling like this is such good news. And here comes the Son of Man, and all these beasts are like wiped off and they're judged. And he's like the king that now is going to rule over everybody. And you're just like, well, the message of this is wonderful. But I guess I'm trying to be real careful, because I'm not trying to blame or throw anyone under the bus from, that I've heard teach these things before. It's just, I guess I never heard that part of it. What I always heard was Rome or Russia or Persia or some new empire, and I didn't know what to do with or make of any of that. And I struggled to find it encouraging because it was more, it just felt disconnected from. I didn't feel like I was. I guess what I would say is what I'm aiming at is, and this whole Revelation series is, my hope is that people continually, again and again and again, see Jesus and see that God is in control and working above all else, and that we can put our faith and confidence in Him more than going, who is this beast? What is this, a microchip? Could this be a vaccine? Could this be a whatever? It's like it takes it out of the realm of personal. Like I no longer. I guess it can make me fearful or make me hesitant about embracing any sort of future technology, but it doesn't call me to discipleship and faith in Jesus. It just tells me to beware of the next whatever. And I mean, Christians for years now, like credit cards were at one point thought to be the mark of the beast. That's a true story. It's like, okay, and because of how they've got numbers on them, and it's now this new way of buying and selling. And so Christians have continually kind of approached, and I know we're getting into chapters that we're not, but like we're looking at it through the lens of, let's be cautious about technology rather than how do I remain devoted to Christ?
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
Which is a much more important question.
Exactly.
So this weekend, you talked about this a little bit when you were talking about Dr. Vlachos and how obey specifically. That was your second point. But let's kind of work through the 3 points, and if you can give a little recap to people if they may or may not have listened to it. So, but I'm going to see if I can remember. Well, one.
Yeah.
This is a letter and a prophecy.
Flip those, but
Okay, this is a prophecy and a letter. I was thinking I might have gotten them flipped, but so unpack that just a little bit.
So most of us know Revelation as a prophetic work, meaning a prediction of the future. It's a picture of what's to come, and I would affirm that it is indeed a picture of what's to come. John's real clear about that from the very beginning. It does he says, these are the things, the things that must soon take place. That's what the Lord tells him. I'm going to show you things that must soon take place. So the idea is that whatever John's seeing is out in front of him. It's coming. And even just the nature, the organization of the book, it flows in a sort of unfolding story-like sequential sort of way. Some people would debate that, but I read it as that. And because there's all this and then language and then, and so you're progressing through, moving forward through this. So it's a prophetic picture of the future, what I would call maybe a culmination of all things, what's going to happen at the end. It doesn't mean, though, that what is going to happen at the end is only going to happen there. I think what happens all through the book is already happening right now, and that'll be a big theme for us as we go through this, because if we put it all out on the future, then it's just a kind of, well, one day be ready for this if and when it happens in your lifetime.
And it makes you more speculative.
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
I was reading 1 Timothy and it talks about like speculation versus stewardship. And so if we think about, we want to be stewards rather than speculators about the future.
That's good. So I think there is an awareness, like a certain alertness, awareness that I'm to have, looking toward the future and wondering, okay, what is happening right now? But at the same time, realizing that the drama of and the reality of what's happening throughout the book of Revelation is already happening. We'll see that as we dig into this. But it's a picture of the future. And then also the second thing I said about it is it's a letter. And so meaning that John wrote it to certain people. There are 7 churches. You can visit the cities today. They're in Western Turkey. This is the province of Asia, not the continent of Asia, the Roman province of Asia, 2 different things. And John is writing to these 7 churches, almost certainly churches that he knew. They knew him. He had likely traveled to them. Maybe these were there were more than 7 churches in Asia. Maybe these were the ones that he had personal relationship with. We don't know. The Lord tells him to write to these 7. But he's writing to these 7. These are real people. And my point was that these are real people going through real stuff, like real persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire in the present. If we make the book, and this is the tension, if we make the book purely a picture of the future, and when I say the future, I mean the way that I've always experienced is it's our immediate future, what's happening in our time. We strip it of its meaning for what it could have meant in their time. Because essentially what you're saying is that everything from chapters 4 and forward are all dealing with something happening at the end of time, which we think we're living in. And in some sense, yes, in other sense, I don't know. But I think what's difficult about that is that when you think about these Christians that are suffering, and John is writing them a letter, how would it feel to you if John says, hey, I know you're going through it. Here's a letter. The vast majority of it isn't going to apply to you. It's not going to happen for 2,000 more years. But just know that I wrote these things down, and anyway, here you go. Like, be encouraged. How would that encourage you? How would that help you? What would you do with that? What would it feel like to you to be like, but I'm going through this right now, and God gives John a picture of what's to come in 2,000 years? It just seems disconnected to me. Now, I do think that God gave John a picture of what's to come at a great distance. But I think that when I think about it, I think the first church read Revelation and saw themselves in it and said, this is happening. We're living this. I don't think they were thinking there's some distant future reality of which this will all make sense and apply, but that they were feeling it right now.
Yeah.
They were going through it right now. And so the book is both a letter to comfort the church in the present and a picture of the future. And I think that's totally in keeping with the way that God has always worked, because the prophetic things that happened in the Old Testament, speaking of Jesus, were happening then, but also pictures of what was to come. And the whole temple and sacrificial system was all a picture of what God would ultimately do and fulfill in Jesus, but it didn't mean that it wasn't happening at all until Christ came. It was happening just in a different way, or a sort of shadow, or maybe like a form way, not the fulfillment of, not the completion of, but a picture,
foreshadowing.
Of it. A foreshadowing. That's the word I'm looking for.
And this, we talked about this just a little bit, but when God says that I am, or the God who is, who was, and is to come,
that was awesome.
You see those. You see exactly the point that you're making.
So that was stuff I would love to have gotten in today or this weekend. It's just like, at least twice in chapter 1, he's referenced as the one, again and again, Alpha, Omega, this whole beginning end thing, but who is, who was, is to come. He is through all time. Yeah. The past, the present, the future, he is. And so, that would have been a great point. I just didn't have time to get into it.
And then the second is to be obeyed.
Right. So this came directly from Dr. Vlachos. He was the one that pointed this out to me. So verse 3, blessed is the one who reads, and the ESV version I have, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. And blessed are those who hear. So the first thought there is that, what is the context in which this is happening? There's one who reads and those who hear. So he's describing a church. He's talking about a church. And the New Living Translation makes that really clear, that this letter is meant to be read aloud in the church. Well, that was also the case with Paul's letters too. I forget which one, he asks that these be read aloud. Let the church hear this.
And they would need to be, because there's not like a bunch of Bibles sitting around.
Yeah,
so somebody has a letter and they're like, okay, let me read you what Paul said or what John said.
There's no copy to give you. Right. So we all have to read this out loud. And so John wants this read aloud in the church, and he attaches a blessing to it, which is unlike any other book. He says, blessed is the one who reads, and blessed are those who hear. But then he continues and he says, and blessed are those who keep the things written in this book, for the time is near. So that word keep there is the same word that Christ uses in John 14:15. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so the idea is obedience here. And what John is asking for shouldn't surprise us, because this is the nature of the word of God as described by James in James 1, where he talks about not just being a hearer of the word, but also being a doer, being obedient to what it says. And this being God's word is the same. We're never just to hear it. Yeah. We're to hear and do. So when we read Revelation, our goal should be, all right, Lord, help me obey this book. And that was huge. So talked about that this weekend. And then thirdly, I'm going to see if I can get this down. It's a story that, what is it? Oh, it reframes our perspective. I wish I could have talked about that so much more. I could have preached the whole sermon on this one thought. Reframes our perspective, strengthens our resolve, and calls us to worship. So there's really 3 ideas here. I didn't touch on all 3 of them. I wish I could have. So reframing our perspective. Well, John writes in fantastic language.
Yeah.
There are dragons and beasts and scrolls and lampstands and imagery that would have probably made more sense to a first century Jew or someone coming who had put their faith in Christ as Messiah. Some of the imagery that he's using, well, not some, so much of John's imagery is Old Testament imagery. And he's drawing on Zechariah, but he's drawing on lots of other places where he's referencing different things.
Yeah, was it like 500 times?
Oh, really? I don't know.
I don't know. It's a lot. Sorry. Yeah. I feel like it was like 500.
Well, we can put a stamp on that if you feel it.
Generally speaking. More or less. So
sure.
Yeah, I put them off.
More or less. If you're off a couple hundred, it will be no big deal.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so he's drawing on a lot of this Old Testament imagery that sometimes we're not familiar with, but he's using this. And I wanted to talk about the power of story. I probably will at some point get into the power of stories. Stories transcend culture. They speak to us in ways that are that speak even to a different part of our brain. Even the brain function of the arts and stories, it bypasses your logic filter and it goes to a different part of your being that that just a didactic logical argument does not do. And John writes and records this prophecy in something of the form of a story. I said this weekend, it has more in common with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings than it does with, say, Paul's letters, in the sense that it's style and format. It's a fantasy novel in so many ways. Now, don't hear me saying that it's fiction or that it's just purely symbolic. I do think that and what's interesting and tough about Revelation is that you don't always know when is John speaking symbolically and when is he speaking literally. So when he speaks of, let's say, locusts, is he speaking about literal locusts? Is this symbolic? What does he mean? And some of the language is clear. We can understand, and some of it's even interpreted for us. For instance, in the first chapter, when it references Jesus being amongst the 7 golden lampstands, the angel tells him the lampstands are the churches.
Yeah, makes it clear.
He makes it clear. But in some places, you don't get an interpretation like that. So you're left to try to figure it out. What are you thinking?
Well, I think that's interesting because you were talking about how Revelation should be read to like a soundtrack.
Yeah.
And if you think about the idea of these locusts, it's more about the feeling that you get than actually literally saying, oh, well, it's definitely locusts or it's definitely this. No, if you think about this massive, overwhelming swarm of something that's going to decimate you, you're left with a specific type of feeling.
Interesting.
And so, I think that kind of takes us out of like that, well, what is it, to say, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, interesting. Well, and one of the things that Dr. V said in our gatherings, which I thought was great, was when you read C.S. Lewis, you don't say to yourself, wait a second, animals can't talk. Beavers don't speak. Lions don't talk. You take the story at face value because it's a story and you understand its form. And I think when we read Revelation and we're reading about beasts and we're reading about lambs and dragons and this and that, if we read it in the format that, like a story format, I think hopefully the idea is that the meaning starts to, what you're meant to feel and take away from it starts to become clearer rather than trying to understand what every detail relates to in a literal, let's call it scientific kind of world where we don't have dragons and beasts and of the description that we find in Revelation. So anyway, it's a story that's meant to reframe our imagination. So the thought around that, I didn't get to get into any of this, but something about being taken out of your world, I think helps you see what's going on in a way that you wouldn't see staying where you're at. So the example that I had of this was to think about, we just had a bunch of guys go to Colorado for a ministry that we do here called Mountain Men, and they go out there and they climb a mountain, but they're really going to hear from God. And one of the things they say is that the mountain is just the excuse. And I love that. But it's interesting as well that the mountain seems necessary. And it's getting out in creation and sitting by, why being in a place where there's this beautiful, stream or wherever, this meadow that you're in. Can God not speak to me at home? He absolutely can, but maybe there's some things that he wants to say to you that in the middle of your routine, you're just not going to hear. So, you know what I'm saying? It's like life just kind of, so it's sort of breaking away from all of that and changing everything for just a few days helps you see things in a different way. And I wonder if Revelation is written as it is to help us see things in a way that we might not otherwise see them. It's breaking us out of the kind of ordinary world that we live in and describing leaders and empires and cultural values using language that puts a face on it or a helps you. Like in one part of Revelation, there's a lamb he looks like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon, and it's like, okay, that's telling me something, right? And so but that visual language helps me see what he's saying, I think, so much more easily than trying to just describe him in I don't know, in a more logical sort of abstract didactic sense, I guess, if you will.
Well, what you're really hitting on is the idea of apocalyptic or an apocalypse, which is this. It's a revealing. It's you really understanding what's going on in a different kind of way. So it's this, John wants to, like, I don't know why I have it.
It's almost like George Orwell's what's the Animal Farm or whatever it is?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what you
know what I'm thinking of?
What?
Men in Black. Is it where there's this whole little world that's like living in a locker?
Interesting. Probably. Sounds right.
Like, there's just these little people. They have a whole city, and then you open up the locker, and then, like, Will Smith looks, and maybe I'm mixing movies. Right. But this is like, he's like taking the lid off. And ripping back that veil between heaven and earth. So you are so convinced that this is one way. And John's like, I need you to see more. And ultimately, Jesus wants them to see.
I think and there's a long history of this, even in our own world, where you take like, and I've not read, I think it's Orwell's Animal Farm, but it's basically talking about human relationships through the lens of how animals would react on a farm, and so you start to see people, personalities, roles show up in these. But why do that? Why make them animals? And I think it's easier to hear when it comes at you in that form than it is to say, there are some people who are like this. Yeah. And there are other people who are like this. And so some movies are metaphors, they're pictures. Some stories are pictures that help you see, in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise seen.
How many people are going to reference the tortoise and the hare throughout their lives? Oh,
sure.
You're a tortoise. Oh, you're a hare. It is that, it serves you in a really interesting way to help you get out of your own schema.
There are lessons in those things, and you see something in those stories that
it's really good.
They're fantasy on the one hand, but they're reality in another.
Yeah.
And I think that's what John's doing.
He is. He totally is. And then there was, perspective.
Reframing your perspective, building your resolve. So that was really more where I focus, which is the idea of enduring persecution, enduring difficult times, facing death, the worst day of your life. And so, what I talked about there was just, that these churches and who John's writing to, they are really facing the reality of persecution. We don't have a necessary record of widespread imperial persecution from Rome against Christianity, but you do have local, more localized persecution. So depending on where you lived would depend on, and what your governor was like, would depend on how you might get treated. And so if you happen to be, like, I read the letter from Pliny the Younger, who was writing to Emperor Trajan, talking about basically putting Christians on trial to figure out whether or not they were Christians because they refused to worship the emperor. And so he brings them in. He says, basically, if they confess to being Christians, I interrogate them once, twice, a third time. If they still won't recant, then I just have them executed. And so what I was trying to do is just help us feel that. What does that feel like? Imagine that that's you. Imagine that that's the reality that you're living in. What would and could sustain you? How do you face death? How do you face an uncertain future? But it's more than just how do you face persecution. How do you face cancer? How do you face the potential loss of a child? How do you face the loss of a job or abuse or whatever. Like how do you face the worst of what life has to offer and what it throws at you? How do you face it? How do you look at it when a world that seems maybe increasingly against you or whatever, a scary world, and when you look at an uncertain future, will we destroy ourselves? A threat of nuclear holocaust, like all sorts of horrible things that you can imagine. How do I face any of that? How do I get through it? And I think John's answer is to give the church a picture of Jesus, who is ruling above and over those things. And so read Revelation 1, like 8 or 9, I think it is, through, or maybe no, it's 12. It's 12 through 18. Anyway, it's a description of Jesus, who at one point describes himself at the very end as having the keys of death and Hades, which is to own those things. When you get the keys when you own something. They don't give you the keys when you test drive a car, only when you buy it. And it's as if what he's saying is, I own death. I'm Lord over death. And he goes to great lengths to describe, I was dead, but now I'm alive. I conquered it. And so in conquering death, the answer is that for followers of Christ, or people who, as Paul would say, are in Christ, I'm now in him. I am now, death becomes nothing more than a doorway that takes me into the presence of my Savior, where I'll spend eternity one way or the other, whether he returns and I never, die, I'm my bodily resurrected, and these are all things that we can. I'm thinking of anyone who's listening to this, like, wait a minute, what? It doesn't know much about the end of the Christian story, or I die, but that, I think about someone who really believed that, and what John is giving is a picture of this dragon, this lamb, as we'll get into the story. What could keep me from making from choosing the short-term benefit of living a few more years versus the eternity of allegiance and delight with God and in his presence, And that's what John's kind of framing is like, look, I get it. What you're facing here is difficult, but you need to know kind of where you're at in the story and the big picture of what's going on. And I think when you see that, it does allow a person to stare death in the face and say, do your worst. All you can do is send me to the one I'm going to spend eternity with. What can you do to me? And so it does make for an untouchable, fearless kind of church, which I think is what ultimately toppled the Roman Empire. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but I mean, ultimately, like this little band of Christians that were being persecuted and in the first century, by just a couple hundred years later, we're now.
Who is it that said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know, but that's a great one. I've heard that many times. Yeah.
I want to say it was like Tertullian or something like that, but yeah.
It might be, which is why so many of them were willful. Oh, who was it? Is it Polycarp? Yeah, I think it was Polycarp, who was said to be a disciple of John himself, who went to his death willfully. They took him into the Colosseum, and he went like they were trying, like all of his Christian brothers and sisters were wanting to advocate for him and try to get him out and all this, and he would just be like, no. And it almost feels morbid. I remember reading this, but I think they had a different view of life than we have. They just weren't as attached to the here and now and the present. They saw, maybe if we get a bigger picture of reality, we would not be as hyper-focused on everything that's happening right around us.
Self-preservation.
Yeah.
And then the third, little component of that third point, the call to worship.
Yeah.
When Angela read that, I listened, and then by the end, I was just like,
Dr. V said the same thing. He was moved just hearing Angela read.
Yeah.
I was too.
Yeah.
There was twice, at least two of the services, I was holding back tears or whatever, wiping away tears, standing on the stage, listening to her read. Truly, we were blessed just to hear the book read. And we'll keep doing that throughout this, through this series. But yeah, that was, again, another great point that Dr. V made was that eschatology, so the study of the end, should always begin with doxology. And John begins there. The whole, the beginning of his letter, listen to how he writes this. John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace and peace to you. And then he just starts going off from him who is, who was, who is to come, and from the seven spirits before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings on earth, to him who loves us and released us from our past sins by his blood and has made us a kingdom, priest to God his Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. I mean, there's just, it's like he can't help himself. You feel this with Paul as well. When he starts unpacking the gospel, there are these flourishes. Romans 11 comes to mind, but Philippians 2 comes to mind, where he just kind of goes into this doxology, he just starts praising God there in Scripture. And I think that's, if we don't put doxology before eschatology, we do become revelation hobbyists. We're merely here to solve riddles. If we don't come worshiping, and that I think is sometimes the problem with the study of the book of Revelation, is that we don't come worshiping. We come curious, interested, tell me more, but not so much ready to fall on our face like John did. When I saw him, I fell on my face as though dead. And I think that's the right approach to this book, is to come worshiping, to come with the goal of every week, I want to see Jesus. Every week, I want to know what he's doing. Every week, I want to see him for who he really is. And we're going to get a lot of that as we dig into this book.
And I do think that if we worship in that way, the end result will be obedience.
Correct.
Yeah.
The best compliment I got this weekend was from Pastor Greg, who told me, and he meant this sincerely, like he was really trying to help me hear this. He said, that was beautiful. And he said, it's not just another way of saying like, hey, great job, incredible. That was really beautiful. And I was like, I know exactly what you mean. And thank you for saying so. It's the best compliment I could receive, because that's what I want. Beauty, really, Revelation should be beauty. Like, it should be beautiful. We should see it, because the descriptions of what we're going to see are so fantastic that it really should elicit that kind of response. And if it doesn't draw your heart, if it is more cerebral, curious, I think we're missing the point. We're meant to see Christ for who he is, and that ought to make you want to fall on your knees and worship.